assume that you guys know how to make arguments, that you guys know how to weigh, and that you guys know the kind of stuff that goes into making a case. So this is going to be an interactive workshop, which is for the most part about how you sell what it is that you want to run, as opposed to how you create what you want to run in the first place. So we're going to be looking at things like how you build a story, how you build a narrative that judges will be interested in, how you're able to sell it, and how you can picture paint so that the judge just thinks that whatever it is that you want to sell, whatever it is that you want them to believe, that it is the intuitive thing in the debate or the grown-up or reasonable thing. And I think we have to start by just thinking first and foremost about what a story is. So as you can see on the slides, it's not just like a component of your case. It's not like you do rebuttal, framing, and then storytelling. It is a way in and of itself to just think about how you present your entire case. It's about making sure that the judge believes you when you describe what the world is like now, what is going to change in the motion, or what I call the process, and then what the outcome is after the things change in the motion. So what we call the endpoint. It's all about being believed in your worldview. So let's very quickly just start on how you go about building a good story. The first thing, and I think that this is just crucial, is the analysis that you give, the 5 reasons why, the structure analysis, all of that stuff is way less important than how you package and frame it. Because everyone can come up with 5 reasons why something is or isn't true. But what you need, and what most debaters, I think, lack, especially as you go on to try and break and go further, is that coherent story and that coherent worldview that makes whatever you're saying just seem intuitive. And you'll notice that the best debaters don't feel like they have to, or it doesn't seem like they actually are doing as much analysis. Sometimes it doesn't seem as though they're giving 5 reasons why. And often that's just because they've been able to prove that whatever they're saying is just intuitive. And so they are saving time by not having to prove everything else to the same extent. The second thing is, just like any good story, you have to fight for your beginning, your middle, and your end. And it has to be chronological in that way as well. So make sure that you're starting your cases by aggressively having some sort of explanation or analysis about the status quo, moving into the explanation of the process, and then finishing off by explaining why the world is a better or worse place now as a result of the changes in the motion. And the important part here is to make sure that you dedicate equal time to all of those aspects. So as I said, usually debaters will be really, really good at, for example, why people love democracy or why something works in the motion. But actually, just like any good story, if one link is underdeveloped, then the story feels a bit weird and it feels a bit off. So those 3 parts, the beginning, the middle, the process, and the end, have to have a razor focus, and all 3 of those parts are up for discussion in the debate. And then the final thing on building your story is just something on confidence. Sometimes there are questions in the debate that are really difficult to answer. And by thinking about your cases as stories, you will be able to see where the missing links are. The most common things that it's very difficult to explain are why specifically things change or stay the same, like what the unique aspects of the debate are. And of course, the link between whatever it is that you have to argue in the debate and the outcome that you desire. But what debaters tend to do is they tend to be afraid of answering those questions, and they say, oh, we'll think about it later. Let's just get the stock analysis out. That is the wrong way to think about debating and the wrong way to think about your threats, because bad answers are better than no answer. And what you often see is that the team who wins the room is the team who had any answer to the most important, crucial questions. So when you're thinking about your story, make sure that you're dedicating your time to the difficult questions. I'm going to stop for questions in 1 second, but I just want to give you guys an example with this motion here. So this house believes that news publications should be anonymized and signed as a collective editorial. I believe this was a motion at Euros last year. And when I look at that motion, if you're trying to build a story, we need to be thinking about what the beginning, the middle, and the end is. So we know that this motion is going to be about news publications. And so this is going to be a motion about media and who gets good or bad media. And so I know that my beginning part is going to have a big characterization or explanation for what the current media landscape is like and what is good or bad about it. I then need to think about what the middle of my story is. So, what is the process and what is the change? And I can see that the thing that we have to debate is whether it should be anonymized and signed as a collective editorial. So, that's the process of the motion. So, now I know that when I'm building my story, I have to be thinking very carefully about what the process of anonymization looks like, how it is the same as the status quo, or how it might be different from the status quo. And I need to do the same thinking about what the world would look like if you had a collective editorial as opposed to whatever the status quo is. The final part, of course, would be your ending. And so whenever I take the differences between anonymization and the status quo, or the world where we have a collective editorial versus the status quo, I need to be thinking about why that is a good or a bad thing for the news and media landscape. And so this is what I mean by having your three-part story and recognizing that you have to answer all of those questions and put equal weight into all of those questions. Do we have any questions so far? No? Okay. Sweet. Let's move on then to selling your story. So it's one thing to build your story, and we'll go into how you can do that in more detail in a bit. But obviously, you need to be persuasive and you need to be able to sell the story. And I think this is what debaters probably struggle with the most because it's kind of hard to know how to be believed. But from my experiences judging and speaking, I think that there are like a couple of things you can do. The first thing is appealing to some sort of common intuition. So if the judge just believes that what you are saying or your conclusion is just a logical conclusion from some other thing that the judge already believes, then you're already going to have them hooked to some extent. So if you're trying to prove that the average American is going to make a certain decision, for example, if you can explain to us how the average American thinks or why the average American has a set of views or values that the judge is just going to agree with, then it's a lot easier for you to prove that because all you have to prove is that they would make a certain decision given that they already have a specific set of beliefs. The second thing is see debating just like life, where context is key. So if, for example, I do something or you do something or you hear about a debater on, I don't know, series posting do something, it's it's easier to understand why somebody does something when you have more context about them, about who they are, about why they make the decisions that they make, and when you go deep into why people do what they do or why institutions do what they do. And so, just like you would do in real life when you're trying to understand why people do things, in debating, it's an exercise of reverse engineering. If you want to prove that people or a country or an institution does something, then you need to give context for how they see the world and why they see the world that way, what their history is, and paint a picture for why they would therefore make the decision that they do. And so, if you ever struggle to prove why something is or isn't true, or why somebody does, will, or won't do something, it's always useful to provide context on that group or that person to because that will increase the likelihood that you can then claim that they're going to do what you think they will. So to give another example, let's say that the motion was this House as the USA would restart Iranian nuclear disarmament negotiations. And let's say that the question that we're asking in this debate is, will Iran meaningfully disarm, or engage. I have created a small opening opposition story that might help you to push the narrative that Iran is not going to be willing to engage. And as you can see, it's the Iranian Ayatollah saw Gaddafi give up, so the former president of Libya, give up nuclear weapons and get deposed, saw Ukraine give up nuclear weapons and get invaded. The West aggressively pushes for a regime change where it feels it has power and accepts regimes where it feels it's powerless. So if you are the Ayatollah or the head of the Iranian government, would you give up your most powerful defense? And it actually, hopefully you can see the different colors and highlighting, but the green represents the stakeholder who we think is going to be crucial to deciding whether or not Iran is going to meaningfully disengage. And so when we're selling the story, we're breaking it down to the human level, and instead of going through a long back and forth about the macro factors, which may or may not affect decision making, we're just thinking about how the humans who have power and are ultimately going to make the decisions are going to think. And so the story is about the leader of Iran making a decision. The yellow part then is about the history. So that's the context that we were talking about. What is the frame of reference of the Ayatollah of Iran? Well, this is what they've seen in the news. This is what they've seen in the world. And therefore, we are leading the judge towards the conclusion that obviously they're going to think that they are next if they gave up their nuclear weapons. The blue part is not necessarily true, but it is just a statement for how the West may be perceived to operate. And again, if you're thinking about what the frame of reference is of the person in charge of Iran, you may be able to prove that this is what they believe, that some states do not get pulled up on their regime abuses because the West doesn't have power against them. And then the final part and the final component in grey is very simple, right? It is given all of the above, given all of that context, if you were the decision maker in Iran, would you give up your nuclear weapons? And we framed it in such a way that the obvious answer would be, well, no, you wouldn't. And you can then use that as a push in the debate that Iran won't meaningfully disarm and won't meaningfully engage. And you'll notice here that the Gulf teams can still get up and say, but you get economic benefits, but you get sanctions listed. There are so many arguments in that debate, but I think that this is a powerful way to counter that, because ultimately the people who actually make the decisions are going to have this mindset and they're going to have these facts available to them, and therefore they're not going to make the decision. And so debating is, yes, about incentives, but it's also about looking at the incentives of the people who matter. Any questions? Oh, see you in the chat. Oh, it's back for Lena. Okay. So let's now look at how we go about picture painting. So I think that aggressive picture painting has three key components to it. So as we've already talked about, we have to have, sorry?
Can I ask a quick question on the previous slide?
Of course.
So this slide and the example that you gave is like for an act emotion. Do you think that the part in purple, like we can do this for non-act emotions, then is the part in purple sort of like an implicit weighing against what the other team is going to say? Is that the right way to think about it?
Kind of. So let me deal firstly with the part about it being act emotion. You'll notice that it's an act emotion, but the actor is the USA, right? And so actually, when we think about the Iranian perspective, we're just trying to prove that if the USA, the actor does something, the reaction of somebody else is not going to be what they want it to be. And so this doesn't need to be an act motion about Iran to do this analysis. You can do this analysis in any motion, regardless of whether or not it's an act motion. If it was an economics motion, I could just change all of this to be about the average person or about business owners or about anybody, right? Because all we're trying to prove is that outcomes happen because people make individual decisions, and important people make individual decisions. And then secondly, when you think about it as a weighing, it is kind of a weighing because what you're trying to prove is that there are certain reasons which might convince Iran to meaningfully disarm, and there are certain reasons which might not. And storytelling is not about giving 5 reasons why Iran won't disengage. Storytelling is about just putting out a set of context which makes it seem just obvious that they're not going to engage. So it is kind of a way of weighing why one outcome is going to happen, i.e., Iran is going to disengage from the process, versus another outcome, which Gov might say, which is that they're going to disarm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, let's go on to picture painting then. So the first and most important thing is, and this is what I do, maybe you'll have your own strategy. When I go into prep, I close my eyes and I think about those words in the motion. And if we go back to slide 3, when we were dissecting the news publication motion, I close my eyes and I literally think, what does the process of anonymization look like? Blah, blah, blah. What is the status quo? The stuff that we've already talked about. But the reason I close my eyes for a few minutes is because I'm trying to get pictures in my head of what things look like. And the level of specificity matters. The more you can I kind of think, well, if this were a movie, what would you look like? What would people be doing? How would people be behaving? And that level of detail can be really useful for you because the more grounded and the more you can kind of picture what is happening, the more you'll have confidence in the arguments that you're going to make and the better arguments and stories you'll be able to come up with. And it kind of feeds into point 1, which is that you can have a clear kind of context for your characterizations if you just close your eyes and try to really understand and empathize with that person or that decision maker or that country. The second thing is, and I think this one is really difficult, avoiding contradictions. So what you'll often see is that people will have one argument or one part of their case which relies on a set of assumptions about how people behave or about what the world looks like, and another set of arguments in the same case which relies on the complete opposite understanding of how people behave. And this is what we call like a contradiction, right? And the useful thing about stories is when you and your partner in prep have to flesh out a story, you can try and find a nuanced angle, which means that both of the things that you want to run can be true. And this is what I personally call bridging analysis. So, for example, the most common one that you usually see is people will say that if a certain leader faces a level of scrutiny on the international stage or sanctions, that they will become weak and they will get deposed. But they'll also say that they are going to try and cement control as much as possible in response to the sanctions. So it can't simultaneously be true that the regime is going to get stronger and tighter, and also that it is going to weaken. And bridging analysis is just trying to find the way that your story can work. So maybe you say things like, initially, they would do X, but then something happens and their set of options changes, and then they're going to do Y. So instead of saying they do X and Y at the same time, it is that they do X, and that's bad. And then the set of incentives changes and they do Y, and that's also bad. And it's a lot easier to do that when you think about these motions just as people or institutions making decisions. And when you think about them like stories, which have chronology to them, because you can always use that line, initially X, but then something happened and then Y. Thirdly, then, I mean, we've already talked about granularity, but just to like emphasize the point, I don't think there is any motion or any situation, and we can talk more about this and maybe at the end, where you can't break it down to people and individual decision makers or groups of people making decisions. Almost everything is about that. Even things like economics, which are to do with systems, under their core are about people's decisions. Even when we talk about things like inflation, we're just talking about everyone trying to buy the same good, and so the price is hiking up, right? So if you ever struggle, then get comfortable with talking about how these big abstract concepts that we talk about in debating just come down to individual people making decisions. storytelling only requires you to prove that an individual makes the decision that you want them to in order to prove that the point will stand. And then the penultimate thing I'll say is I think this comes with practice, but try to have a view in your debates about how things work in general. Like the one that my partner and I used to try to really be good at is how countries become developed. But it could also be how do you change people's views? What makes people religious? How does radicalization work? And of course, as the final point says, practice makes perfect. You might want to look at podcasts, talk to your friends, your mirror, or whatever to try and figure these things out. But good storytellers always have an understanding of how things work. That doesn't mean that they are correct in their understanding of how things work. It just means that they can very quickly come up with a basic view on what the beginning, middle, and end is of how things work, and then they can insert it into certain debates. Um, any questions? Because I know that was a meaty slide. No? Okay, let's move on.
I have a question, sorry.
Yeah, of course, go for it.
When you're facing like actor emotions, where you're engaging with like big corps, countries, what do you usually do as a method to breaking things down to what people would really do, but preventing yourself from trying to make those countries similar to people?
That's a really good question. So let's start with countries, right? There are different types of countries. Like basically, you're trying to figure out when we say that like Russia makes a decision or the UK makes a decision, we're actually saying that like the prime minister or the president has made a decision, right? Or the armed forces are doing something. And so the question becomes when we say that these countries make decisions, these countries aren't making decisions, it's individual people. So if it's like an autocratic government, for example, well, what if you are that autocrat and you have power, what kind of considerations do you have? What kind of positives and negatives do you have? What's your thought process? Like when it comes to autocracies, everyone's so comfortable saying Putin does this or Putin does that to describe what Russia does, but it works for democracies too. For example, if we're talking about what the US is going to do, well, what pressures does the president of the US face or the Congress in the US? What are politicians afraid about? What are they going to do? How do these people interact with each other? When we say, is the US going to, I don't know, invade a country or not? Well, what's the argument going to look like in their Congress? How are these people going to resolve that? What are the lobby groups going to be saying to politicians? These are all questions about stories, but the end outcome is that something happens. The USA does something. When you're talking about corporations, it's the same thing. Again, why do corporations? When you say McDonald's has done something, it's not like McDonald's did something. The CEO and board of McDonald's did something because they faced pressure from their board or from their employees or from whatever. And so it goes to show that even big institutions are just about individual people making decisions based on pressures and incentives that they face from other people. Does that answer your question, Samuel?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
No worries. Cool. So, and actually, following on from this, let's talk about what do you do when you're struggling with your story. This always happens. It will happen throughout your debate career, and it's totally fine. But there are always things that you can fall back on. So I said here, number one, you want to identify any analogous process or story that could describe what you're talking about. So, for example, let's say that you have absolutely no idea about emotion. Let's say the motion is about banning candidates from like political dynasty families from entering themselves. So if your dad was president, you can't run for president. Maybe you don't know anything specific about that, but you might know about nepotism, right? You might know about how privilege can be passed from parents to children. And if you can apply that to the political context, you already have a lot of the analysis already for the gut OG arguments for why these people have unfair, undemocratic advantages. Why is nepotism like what is bad about nepotism? well, you can be trained up early, you can be given alliances early. All of these things that we think about, you can just cross apply that to politics. You can meet the right people early. Your father can put you into the right position to gain experience unfairly. This is not analysis that I've run before. This is just thinking about an analogous situation and applying it to this motion. So the second thing then is you should use what you know about the world to create the story, and you should use first principle questions. So when I talk about using what you guys know a lot of things, and I think what you should try and do is think about when you discover new things or learn new things, what could this be similar to? What could this be analogous to? Always have that view in your head because you never know when it could be useful. For example, another random one, if the motion was about companies who use AI or companies who are major employers having to pay a tax just in case they leave an area, that motion could be about insurance because technically the company is making less profits because it is insuring against the harm that it would cause if it left. And seeing it through that lens can allow you to create a story about security and risk and stopping the risk of harm occurring. And then the final thing is, oh, hello? Okay, never mind. Finally, in terms of first principle questions, what I mean by a first principle question is the very basic, bare bones question that you would ask just about the world if this wasn't a debate. If you saw that motion, what does the average person like just generally ask? What kind of random, like abstract question does this evoke from your professor, for example, when the non-debater sees the motion? And to give you two good examples of this, the first, as you can see, is if you are trying to prove that the process of an election leads to the polls narrowing. So maybe if one party was well ahead before the election, by the end, it gets rather level. You could give structural reasons, or you could just ask yourself, what happens when people think that one party is going to win and one party is going to lose? How does it change what people think of them? How does it change how people interact with them during the election? How do elections work? How do people get interacted with? How does the media report on them? How do the parties change the decisions that they make because they think, oh, we're definitely going to win. We just need to not mess it up, or we're definitely going to lose. So let's go for broke and try something radical. And to give you like another example, if the motion was this house would allow parents to be prosecuted for the crimes of their children, and the question was, will it change the behavior of the children? Well, the question I would be asking is, what makes a child who's at risk of committing a crime not do so? And when would they do so versus when would they not do so? Right? Because we're trying to paint a picture in our head of the type of child who is on the verge of committing a crime, what's gone on in their life, and what the parents can or can't do to stop that from happening. Because obviously, if the parents can't do anything to stop it happening, then the behavior of children is not going to change. And if the parents being prosecuted is not going to be one of the things that could change the behavior, then the child, unfortunately, will still go on to commit a crime. Equally, I wanted to show you guys that this also works when you are doing kind of principally analysis. Because if the question that you are answering in the debate was, are parents criminally liable? Then you would want to think about when are people considered criminally liable? And like what makes somebody criminally liable and why just the parents? Are there any other people who could meet the same criteria for being criminally liable? So you open up a whole can of questions for the debate just by thinking about it through very basic questions, which you can then use as the building blocks for your story. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, moving on then. Okay, so moving on to how you would flip this. So we've talked about how you construct. Now, how do you use this in rebuttal and weighing? I think that like It's really great when you have a great story in your analysis. It's often the sign of a really strong, coherent team, but it's probably easier just to do this in rebuttal and weighing. And you guys will probably find it easier. And like if you're going to Euros, you probably want to focus on trying to integrate stories into your rebuttal and weighing because it's the quickest skill to learn. And also, it saves you time because you don't have to give 5 reasons why somebody argument is not true. And as I said here, you have two kind of situations when you are doing rebuttal in a story way. So the first one is just you kind of agree on the other side's kind of premises, you agree that people behave a certain way, you both agree on what the status quo is, but you disagree with like the outcomes, right? And the second one is, of course, you just completely disagree with their understanding of the world. You think people are going to behave in one way, they think people are going to behave in an entirely different way. You think Russia's going to do this, they think Russia's going to do this. In the first case, it's really useful if you can copy the language of the other side and point out that your story is coherent with the premises that they themselves have already accepted. So, for example, if the other side has already accepted that Putin faces XYZ pressures, that like I don't know the way that decisions are made in just following on the Russia's example from Russia is in a specific way, that they've already agreed with you guys about the context and the history and and kind of like the formative experiences and the world news that has probably informed the Kremlin's perspective, then when you're giving your story and you're using those as premises, it's important that you destroy the other side's case by saying their case is incompatible with the reality, because even though they agree with us about all of these things, they can't see that this means that the Kremlin is going to behave in X, Y, Z ways. So you can take it down. And often this is really easy because the other side won't have put this level of detail into having a story in the first place. They'll just have like an argument or a case. And so your premises will just seem intuitively to lead to your conclusion and not theirs. In the second situation, this is probably the most fun kind of one, but you want to just discredit the realism of their story. And as I point out in the slides, everyone has a story. The question is whether or not you're aware and you've put in the effort to construct it. So this is where you want to be saying things like they genuinely believe, even though people behave like this, and even though people do X, Y, Z, they genuinely believe that Y is going to happen. You want to make it seem ridiculous given the premises and the framing and the storytelling that you've already done about the status quo and the work that you've done to explain what the process is going to look like, why it's silly for them to believe that that the world is like an alternate way. So to give you an example again, if the motion is this House supports an international ban on controlling interest in public companies, so meaning that if a foreign firm is not allowed to own more than 25% of a public company in another country. And if the question is, of course, will this harm the investment and the financing for companies? If you're on Gov and obviously run that you get way less investment, the Gov good rebuttal could be, well, if we both accept that these are places where you already have public companies, then this means these are places where you have stock markets. And if we accept that investors already have loads of money pumping into our country, that means that our country is an attractive place to invest. So to say that investment is going to plunge seems unrealistic because we already have a stock market, and clearly a good one because international investors are willing to come and they are attractive assets. And this is really useful because obviously the other side now has to prove that foreign investment won't come because they can't have a controlling interest. They can't just say foreign investment won't come in general. And there's no reason given as to why that would be the case. And if you're trying to weigh, you would be like, well, even if we accept that there's going to be less money, let's think about how foreign investors behave. And again, the argument is about foreign investment, but the storytelling way of doing rebuttal is just to tell a story about a foreign investor and about how they will choose to behave. So when do they leave markets? They leave markets on a whim. They take money back to their own country. They make sometimes they're state-owned themselves. They make decisions based on what their governments want them to do. So all of these things are just me putting out some characterization about what foreign investors might look like to end with to get back to the end point almost that the money might not even be worth it in the first place. You might be better off if these people just do go and they do take their money with them. Does anyone have any questions about that? No? Okay, cool.
Actually, maybe just one question on the rebuttal stuff. If
Of
you're
course.
giving like a storytelling bit of rebuttal and they have like loads of like reasons like flagged and stuff, I feel like a lot of times hear from judges if you give rebuttal, they go, well, you didn't engage with like the actual reasons or you didn't explain how your reasons are more important. Does that come down from just selling it better or explicitly saying it at the end?
That's a really, really good question because it comes right down to the core of how do you deal with teams who just have five reasons why everything is true. Very simply, the secret is number one, usually they only have three reasons, packaged as five. Number two, often all of the reasons will have the same assumptions about how the world works. Okay. If they don't, then that's actually a problem because it means that they're contradicting themselves within their arguments. If they say, for example, reason one is because people are going to react in one way, and then they say reason two is because people are going to react in another way, then you can just point that out. But let's assume that it's a really, really good team who have five reasons why. Those reasons still are assuming like a certain understanding of how the world works. So, for example, if the motion was about I don't know, it was about like a political franchisement. Let's say it's about Trump winning the election or something, and they have five reasons why this is going to lead to, I don't know, more emboldened alt-right kind of anti-election conspiracy if he loses. You're still relying on a basic premise about how the group of Trump supporters behave and what they believe. And so instead of answering each individual line of analysis, if you just win the story of how these people are likely to behave, and that story conveniently aligns with your analysis, then you will win. So the kind of thing that I would do in that situation, instead of responding to like all five lines of analysis of why there will be a capital riot, would be like, look, these people are tired. 2021 was a real reckoning. A lot of people don't want to associate themselves with that criminality. Like there's a lot of fake news on Twitter, but people are just tired of the back and forth about it. All of that kind of vibe. Because what I'm trying to do is trying to frame why people are just not going to do that. Whereas what they're trying to do is give a bunch and a list of reasons. If the judge just naturally believes that I've just told the truth and I've just framed the world, then their reasons aren't going to be considered as impactful. And you see this a lot, in particular in like better rooms. Does that make sense, David?
Yeah, that does. Maybe just one question off that. If you were to explain the understanding of the world, would you feel like you have to flag after, okay, if you believe this, the reasons don't stand, or do you leave that out, kind of?
Ah, yeah, sorry, I forgot about the second part of your question. Absolutely. So what I would say is, they've given you all these five reasons, but at the core, they just don't understand like the context of these people, right? And then you might want to like flag one or two of their reasons. Be like, so when they say, oh, so this is gonna happen, well, these people are tired, so this isn't going to happen because blah 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 blah. So you're not responding to each reason, but you're just kind of going above their head and you're trying to prove to the judge, you see all of those reasons, this kind of supersedes all of that. Does that make sense? You do want to reference
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
it. No worries. And actually, this comes down to I think the final thing we'll talk about. There was one more slide on team dynamics, but I will share the slides and you guys are more than welcome to have a look at that. The final thing I want to talk about is style. Everybody has their own style, obviously, and you're going to have to find your own via trial and error. But there are two big aims of your style when it comes to storytelling. the first aim is just to make you feel comfortable and confident, because often when you're doing storytelling, you have to be quite bold. There are going to be five reasons why on the other side, and you have to be like, no, 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 no. They just don't understand the world. They're building reasons on a nonsensical foundation. And that requires you to have a style that just allows you to be confident in giving it. And whatever that may be, that's fine. But the second, I think, more important aim is the judge needs to be disarmed. So the reason that storytelling works is because yes, judges will look at their notes, even good judges will look very hard, but ultimately, if you call it framing, if you call it characterization, if you use too many debatory words, then the judge's back is going to be up and they're going to be judging it more like a technical speech. The way that this works is, and again, this you often see this from the best debaters, is it's more conversational. It's more just like you're giving a lecture. It's more like you're just explaining how the world works. And very conveniently, that's why you're obviously right. And so you want to try and find the style and the intonation that works for you to kind of get to that point where it doesn't sound as debatory, because that will often allow you to just stylistically go above the room. And I promise you, it really does affect even the perception of the best judges in deliberation. We have a question. It's called, what is the main difference between storytelling and a debate speech? Oh, a story. So a debate speech would be like, here are 3 points of framing for blah, blah, blah. And they'll give 3 points of framing and they won't be directly connected to the world. They'll just be like 3 observations. And then they'll say, so with that in mind, we're going to have 2 arguments and they're going to give the arguments and then they're going to give their weighing. And the framing will relate to the case that they're giving, but they won't have picture painted. They won't have explained it in a way or in a kind of on a granular level that will make the judge just believe that it's true. It will come across as very high level and kind of what we call like esoteric. So it will be kind of theoretical. And at its core, it will be less detailed as well. Often you'll get 5 reasons why, but those 5 reasons will be more like 2 because you haven't really thought about the nuance of how processes work or what the world looks like. And so often a debate speech will be more matter heavy, but it will be less strategic because it will be less focused on what is changing in the world and it will be less focused on what the end point actually looks like. I hope that makes sense, Hannah. But I think the main difference is that this allows you to be strategic and it allows you some word economy as well. And it allows you to just be a bit more believed as well by the judges. Let's ignore, actually, this example matters. So, for example, so what you might have are situations where the kind of other debaters have dismissed your arguments for being niche, or they'll dismiss your arguments for not applying in the majority of circumstances. And this is why examples matter. If, for example, you get told that your case is only relevant in this small subsection of cases, a storytelling debate speech would reference the other set of cases that you've been accused of not being relevant for and create some sort of quick narrative for how your beginning, middle, and end works in those contexts too. So I remember, for example, in the Euros semi-final, my partner and I were running a case about how property values are going to go down and that's going to be great for young people. And we got told that our case was irrelevant because property prices aren't going down in the majority of liberal democracies, only in really wealthy countries like the UK. And so at the start of my whip speech, I said, well, hold on. There's been so much new EU funding into Hungary, and so house prices have skyrocketed in Budapest. Is this true? Is this not true? I don't know, but it's about selling a story. Hold on, the increase of FDI and global finance has meant that normal young people can't afford to live in Rio and they're having to be pushed further and further out. That's not the UK. So that's not me giving like 5 reasons why like mine is the majority set of cases. That's just me using a set of examples that that our case has been accused of neglecting, and just putting our problem into those examples, so that the judge thinks, yeah, Hungary is in the debate, yeah, Brazil is in the debate, yeah, that is also a problem in those countries. So and it only takes 10 seconds, but it has a huge impact in terms of your ability to be able to push your argument. Okay. We will have like a separate bit near the end where you guys can ask any questions. If you have like any motions, for example, or any kind of points where you think it would be difficult to storytell and you want kind of a guided example of how you would do that, then please feel free to give me them. But at this stage, what I would like to do is to have you guys try this for yourselves. So, is Parth, still there?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I believe that we have some breakout rooms. Is
Yeah.
there any way to assign these Parth? How do you think it would be like easiest to do this?
I can assign people automatically in the groups that you would like the number wise, or I could just open them and the people could join them, but I'm not sure what you'd want to do.
Okay, I don't mind. Can we just do like a random assigning of people 1 to 3?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to put you guys all into breakout rooms or paths, and we're going to start with the first motion on the screen. So the EUDC 2021 Round 8 motion. This House believes that states should prioritize high unemployment rates at the expense of significantly slowing down technological advances, e.g. taxing automation, setting a minimum quota for human employees, or banning limiting the use of certain technologies. Now, I don't mind if you guys want to focus more on gov or opposition. I would encourage you to focus on the side that you think you would struggle with the most if you saw that motion. But what I want from you guys is an explanation of the problem on either side, the process, so the process of prioritization, remember, what is that going to look like? And then I want a kind of story in as granular level detail as possible to explain any points that you want to make. So if your point is that businesses are going to be less efficient, I want you to explain in granular detail how this prioritization policy is going to lead to those changes which make businesses less efficient, for example. As I said, I don't mind about the side that you choose. So should we start with that first motion? I don't know if we have breakout rooms yet.
Okay, I've assigned people randomly to some rooms.
Okay, amazing. Amazing. Am I able to go into any?
I can assign you. Yeah, I can assign you. Hold on. Right.
Thank you. I went around to everyone's rooms and it sounded like everyone was having some really good discussions. We're not going to do the second motion per se, but I just want to give you guys just a few quick kind of pointers on some of the things you might have been thinking about when looking at these motions from a storytelling perspective. But of course, you guys have some really interesting arguments which were different to this. So the way that I saw this motion very generally was this is about progress versus protection. And because this motion is so broad, when we're talking about technological advances, I was thinking, when do we deprioritize economic progress? And when do we prioritize the protection of workers? And does prioritizing protection actually mean that we're going to improve people's welfare? What are things going to look like on the ground? So when I was trying to think, well, what is a similar example? I was thinking maybe when it comes to the development of, I don't know, like nuclear weapons or missiles or with fossil fuels, we don't really care that much about companies' profits because there's some sort of wider aim that we prioritize. And then I thought, well, what does the process of prioritization look like? There are usually lobby groups. We usually crack down harder on some industries more than others. There's usually a strong moral push that we give. And yes, does it make these industries like worse and less efficient? Probably, but we think that there's some sort of overarching good which makes that worth it. And so when I'm selling the story of any argument on either side, I'm thinking, am I leaning towards progress? And if I'm in opposition, I'm definitely leaning towards progress. Look at all the cool things we could do. And if I'm on the government side, I'm leaning towards protection. Look at all the people who we leave behind or we harm as a result of that progress. but you guys had more specific arguments about agriculture and stuff like that, which was really cool. And then just very quickly on the second motion, because I know some of you guys were talking about it, again, we're looking at very basic questions, like what does the quota actually look like? Or without the quota look like? What is the effect on players from the developing world? Like, how does this change how teams recruit and scout for players? Like, do fans care? Does it change what fans care about? And how do national teams get good? Does this make a national team better or worse? So these are all of the kind of general questions that I would use to kind of build up my story either way to support having a quota for domestic players or to oppose it. Very quickly, now that we've reached the end of the session, if anyone has any like specific motions or questions where they would be wondering how storytelling perspective could be implanted, I know that we had some of them earlier, but if you have any, then just shoot and I'm happy to answer. It's a great question. Often it's a question that people who do schools debating ask because you get taught to kind of just give rigid structures because that's how kids understand arguments working. But honestly, there's no substitute to just trial and error. But a very basic structure you might want to employ is when you're doing your more analysis dense parts of your speech, just encase it within a storytelling structure. So when you're framing what the status quo looks like, if you want to be the person who has 5 reasons why the status quo looks the way it does, then that's fine, right? If that's your style, that's fine. The slide that we actually missed out in this lecture was advice for how team dynamics work. And I think it's important that there's one member of the team who is more mechanical. So when I was debating, my partner Aniket was the guy who was like, there are 5 preconditions for X to be true. I'm going to go through each of these and prove why they are true. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you just need a balance. And I think that the honest answer to your question is that storytelling isn't necessarily about being the person who is flowery. It is about being the person who is granular. And so one easy fix when you give your 5 reasons why is to at least then insert some level of granular detail for how people are going to behave. So here are 5 reasons why something happens. And so as we can see, that is why X person makes Y decision. That is what is influencing X person. Or when we're talking about the process, here are the 5 aspects of what the process looks like. Here is how then, I don't know, the outcome that we want is fulfilled by those 5 things. So it's the same kind of structure as a story, but you're just being a bit more technical with it. Does that make sense?
The arguments or how to flag reasons that are taking as reasons with kind of a storytelling structure. Sometimes I feel like if I tell things or give some story, they don't take them as reasons. And then this is the second bit, just on how to manage time when you're doing with this method. Is it just practice or any tips on it?
So to answer the first question, integrating it into like, let's say like it was like a leader of the opposition speech or like an extension speech, right? I think the most important thing is that you think about the speech not as having a like set structure, but as fulfilling a specific set of things. So let's say that your story is X happens, and then that happens, and then that leads to Y. What I would be doing first and foremost, part 1 of my speech, here is what the world looks like. Here's my analysis. Part 2, here is what uniquely changes, and here is my analysis. Part 3, here is why the outcome that we have achieved is the most important thing in the debate. That is the same as a storytelling structure. As I was saying to Henny, it's just that what I'm doing there is I'm being as regimented as possible in the beginning, middle, and end parts. Now, if I was a wit speaker, I might do like the whole, here's how the world works. So let's talk about how countries develop, kind of broad stuff. But if you're giving the constructive part, then you want, as I said, you want to be very regimented about framing what the world looks like, what happened, and how we got to where we are. And that will be true for any argument that you make in any position in any round. It will also be true with rebuttal. There's that, and in terms of time management, I think it helps your time management because you have to prioritize, right? You have to focus, you have to frame the beginning, you have to frame the middle, you have to frame the end. you have to apportion equal or relatively equal time to all of those parts. And so if it helps you, have a timer in your speech, be like at 2 minutes, I'm moving on to the process part, and at, I don't know, 5 minutes, I'm moving on to the end part. But it's a lot easier than just putting out argumentation, because argumentation has a less clear structure, and so you're more likely to get lost. Does that make sense, David?
Yeah, I think just on the first bit of structure, it's if you have like three arguments, would you do three different beginning, middle, end, or have them be integrated in the middle? Or
Good point. So usually you won't have three arguments, because usually you won't have enough time to do three arguments in sufficient depth. And what if you think about your story, and if you think about prep, like finding a story, often what you'll find is the three arguments that you thought you had are probably just three kind of things which flow already from your framing of the status quo. Because it might be that argument one is people are going to disengage. Argument two is that, like, I don't know, like you're going to get like echo chambers. And argument three is this. These are all just things which flow from having an understanding of how people are going to react. And so often what you'll find is you can completely and radically change your debating structure instead of having three arguments by just framing in the way that I've described. And those arguments then just become outcomes which flow naturally from your understanding of how things were and how things were then changed. Does that make sense, David?
yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Amazing. Okay, next on my screen is Nikolai.
Thanks. So I know that you gave example of storytelling for a more spec emotion with when you gave the example of I want to say Hungary and Rio de Janeiro. But when it comes to like really specky, really like knowledge heavy tech and econ motions, for example, like from UCL Pro, I'm like this house would ban dividends. Considering that I already have content issues with motions like that because I'm not an econ girly, how would you go about trying to sell a story, considering that probably in those situations I'm not entirely sure about arguments as well? That's how to sound convincing. I know it's a very stupid question, sort of, but how to sound convincing when it comes to storytelling on motions that you do not know much about?
Oh, you are asking me basically about like the secret sauce of debating. Like, how do you sound like you're on the pulse of things you know nothing about? It's hard. So I would say two very quick things. The first thing is, as I said, analogous situations matter. So yeah, if you don't know, and hopefully there was the intro said about dividends, but if you don't know anything about dividends, unfortunately, there's no substitute to learning a little bit. But literally, all you would need to know in that motion is that a dividend is a constant stream of income, or a set amount of income that you get for holding a share. And so, in my mind, I'm thinking, if I hold the share, I get this income. It's quite safe, it's quite secure. Even if the value of the share goes up or down, you get the income either way. So you're kind of sweet. So this is about providing some sort of security to investors, right? Or on the other side, it's regardless of whether your company is doing badly or doing really well, you're paying out the same dividend to people and the same dividend to investors. So actually, what you're doing is disconnected from the performance of the company. Is that good or is that bad? And I know that that is like, maybe that's me having some knowledge and inserting that, but usually the level of knowledge you need is a lot lower in spec motions than you think, because you just need to think about why people do things. So in the dividends motion, why do investors like dividends? Why do companies give dividends? Are the first questions that I would answer. And if you have a view on that, then you'll be fine in that debate. Like, you don't need to know anything. Maybe somebody will come up in CG and be like, no, actually, that's not why that happens. Maybe that will happen, whatever. But most of the time, everybody else in the debate will be like, I don't really know either. And the econ team will be like so in their head about their knowledge that they won't be able to prove that you're wrong. So half of it is just having the confidence as well to be like, here's why investors like dividends. Here's why you like a steady stream of income. Here's why businesses give it to them, and then make your arguments from those premises. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's why I thought that that's like it's a kind of very typical question, how to be confident when you're not. But like specifically, I had an issue with that. I half forced that round, so maybe it's PTSD. But yeah, it makes perfect sense. Thank you.
No worries. And I think the takeaway from that is just being, and when you don't know anything, let's get it down to people. Let's bring it back to people, people making decisions. Your people are investors and company bosses. Boards interacting with companies. That's what that dividend motion is probably about, if you know nothing. Next on my screen is Samuel.
So my question is kind of similar with what Miko I just asked. It's just related to how to do those storytellings without seeming like we have an entire message argument burden to explain how those people interact with the narrative, and not integrating this unnecessarily with all the other burdens that we already have in explaining what change happens in our side of the house, etc.
Okay, so I'm not sure if I 100% understand your question, Samuel, but the one thing I would say is don't see storytelling as an additional burden. It is the way that you fulfill your burden. So, you know, like when you're like, oh, well, there's an additional burden of how things change. No, 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 no. Storytelling is how you prove that things change in the first place. So, uh, when you're doing storytelling, again, it's not just like an extra device. You're using it to help people prove these things. If there's a motion where you're thinking, ah, shit, like how do I know like what is different on our side versus the other side? Again, we close our eyes, we think about what kind of things, however small, are changing, and don't be biased about it. Be neutral. Like just because you're on guard, it doesn't mean that you have to put pressure on yourself and threat to think about which things are good that change. Just close your eyes and think what is actually just changing in the world, and then what do we want generally from the motion, and then how can we prove that the things that are changing are leading to the things that we want in the motion. And when it comes to explaining discrete parts of your analysis, like how something changes, there is no substitute to having a view on how a process works. So if the motion is like, I don't know, because we keep talking about it, or I keep talking about it, like radicalization and how people become more polarized, have a view and a story for how that will work. Is it via Twitter? Is it that, you know, all of these like edge lords who now have ticks because Elon Musk has given everyone the verified symbol are chatting shit and now everybody is liking the messages. And so it comes up on your Twitter because it has 6,000 likes. Is it the perception that you're not alone and you're actually in the majority because of your algorithm? I'm not making an argument. I'm just giving you a story that makes the judge think, polarization is going to occur. And the final thing is, make sure that you're as specific as possible for how the things that change in the motion have caused this. So if the motion is, for example, about the US election causing polarization, how is the US election doing that? Is it the coverage of the election? Is it the speeches in the election? Is it the memes in the election? So always bring it back to what the thing that has to change in the motion and build your story from there. And usually you'll find that your story will answer all of the questions that you had as burdens. Does that make sense? Okay, excellent. Next person on my screen is Jeremiah and then Wendy.
Hi. The one question that I was having was, especially in the context of like the European circuit, where there's like a lot of the meta of like five structural reasons, be really technical and analytical. How to avoid judges just perceiving your speech as like, it's one of these speeches that just has style, so to speak, and no content. Because it's like, it's really hard for that to come across and for some judges to just kind of like dismiss your argument. So how do you cater to that kind of adjudicator as well?
Yeah. So here's the thing. I know that it sounds as though this is just debating for lazy people, and that you have less arguments. But often, what is happening when you're forcing yourself to see the debate via stories, you are more strategic and you are just spreading out your analytical rigor, so to speak, more broadly into the questions that matter. So yes, you're right. There'll be teams who have 5 reasons why, blah 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 blah. Often, the way that you prove this to judges is to make sure that you have concluding sentences. So if I've given you this long story about how polarization works, you need to tell the judge, what does this strategically mean for the debate? It means that the opposition can't get away with saying that people are going to do da da da, even if they had a million reasons why it was going to happen, because they fundamentally misunderstand that this is how people behave, and this is what people are going to see, and this is people's pre-existing set of beliefs, and this is how naturally they're therefore going to react. That level of intuition is way more powerful, as I said, because you've ticked off every single aspect of how people make decisions, which is why I say have a view on how things work, have a view on
Yeah,
how.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but my Wi-Fi cut out about like 30 seconds ago. So I missed out on the last bit of.
That's okay. TLDR, it's really important to have a view on how things work, because what you'll find is that you're more strategic than the team who has 5 reasons why on certain burdens, because via having seen the debate through a story, you're covering every aspect of what you need the judge to believe, how people see things, how people interact, what their pre-existing beliefs are, where are they seeing these things. And often it is just a bit of vibes, but the specificity of having a picture, like you saw something on Twitter or this, that, or the other, is the difference between the judge believing you and not believing you. And yes, as we talked about earlier, be very explicit in pointing out that the other team have just stacked a bunch of reasons on one burden. Maybe they've explained why people like hate Biden or something. Fine, whatever. I'm telling you where people are going to see the content and why that's going to be problematic. I'm telling you what people believe before. I'm telling you all of this stuff. When you've put 5 reasons on everything, you won't have time to explain and give 5 reasons for everything. And sometimes there just aren't 5 reasons why something is true. There's just one reason that's really true, which is why telling a story and seeing your arguments through stories make it more believable, because you're just covering more bases. And if you're asking me, how do you weigh that up for a judge? Well, one team gave you 5 reasons why Trump supporters hate Biden. I've given you reasons why yes, they have pre-existing beliefs. I've given you reasons why the way that they're going to see this is going to be bad. I've given you reasons why the way they're going to talk about it is going to be bad, why they're going to get really pissed off about it. That is just covering way more strategic burdens. So this is, yes, an analysis light way of debating, but it's a strategically heavy way of debating. And that's how you weigh against the judges. And you make teams look silly for focusing so narrowly on one precondition for winning the debate. Does that make sense, Jeremiah?
Yes, it makes sense. It makes sense. Thank you so much.
No worries. I believe it was Wendy next.
Hi, I was just wondering, when you tell a story, often for the story to be compelling, it have to be a specific example. For example, in the motion, This House Regrets, Love is About Sacrifice, you often bring in like motherhood or single mothers, etc. How do you counter when the opposition stands up and say, this is such a cherry-picked example, it is narrow. It's just about one kind of stakeholder. But often at the same time, you have to narrow it onto an individual actor for it to be something compelling. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm making sense.
I think so. I think it correct me if I'm wrong, and please like interrupt me if I'm going off course, but I think that this comes back to what I was saying before about how you can like win the frame or battle through a story. So if they say to you, this whole motherhood thing is just such a narrow set of examples, the burden is actually on them to give counter examples that are congruent with the motion. So they need to give other examples which prove that love isn't about sacrifice. They have to give examples of conditional love. If I was you and I was talking about motherhood and things like that, and it's saying it is about sacrifice, I would say, look, there are just inherent things about the way that we love people, right? How do we love people? Again, I'm having a view on a process. How does love work? And I would just explain that it requires sacrifice, because you need to be able to put somebody before yourself in order to feel that true love, in order to be social, all of this stuff. And when they say, well, you're just cherry picking, literally ask them to give you an example of love that doesn't involve sacrifice. And you can then say, well, love without sacrifice isn't love in the first place, because the way that people love requires them to be able to put themselves before, like put that person before them at certain times, or you'll never get compromise on anything. And again, if you want to go, we can go into even more depth and we can say, why is that necessarily the case? Because the way that we build love is through having agreeable relationships. And if you want to go into that level of detail, how do individuals interact in relationships? Well, sometimes I want something and they want something else, but we have to come together as a team, right? There has to be sacrifice. All I've done there is explain how my weird debatory conception of how relationships work on an individual level. But by the end of it, if the judge believes that relationships have to have a give and take, then the judge believes that relationships have to have sacrifice. And so it's really hard for the other side to then say that you're cherry picking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Cool. So the takeaway there is examples are great, like motherhood or whatever, but actually stories can also be about processes and analysis as well, just so that it seems intuitive. I think the final question is from Trish.
Hi. So I actually had two questions. First was with relation to something David said earlier during the thing. So like when you were answering his question about how to rebut teams who come up with like 5 reasons, blah, 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 blah. And you said that it's mostly based on one underlying world assumption, and then, you go ahead with it. But what about the debates where you do agree with the assumption of like their world? So both of you are on the same page with the frame or the characterization. In those scenarios, when you get these mech heavy teams, 5 reasons, blah, 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 how do you then rebut them effectively?
Okay, yeah, so this is question one. So I think the thing to point out is when people say they have 5 reasons, what are the 5 reasons actually proving? Because often what you'll find is that their 5 reasons are supporting the framing and the premise of this stuff, right? And so you can sometimes just concede the 5 reasons and still be right. Like all it will be, the only difference will be they'll say, and this means X, and you'll say, but no, all of this means Y. And so the question becomes, who has done the best job of explaining why these kind of contextual factors lead one way or the other? And that's not really a debating skill. Like if I said to you, like, why do people like murder or something? It's not really a debating skill. You just have to be the person who can be like, come on, guys, like this leads this way, it doesn't lead that way. And I think part of that just comes down to reiterating that if all of these things are true to your story makes more sense. And it's not about having 5 reasons why, if all of those things are true, your story makes more sense. It's about doing everything that we've talked about in the workshop so the judge just believes that your understanding flows naturally from those premises. The second thing to note is if a team is giving 5 reasons why X is true or Y is true, they're debating by fulfilling discrete burdens. And this often means that they haven't had this coherent understanding of how their like case works in the story. And what this often means is that like they are aware that the premises that we're talking about will lead to a certain conclusion, but they haven't actually like thought about like on a very human and like granular picture level what that looks like. And so the fact that you've picture painted and you've actually explained what this means for an individual and what this means for decision makers is going to be more powerful because their arguments are going to sound very and the end of their argument will be 5 reasons and therefore asserting that they're right, whereas yours is going to be like story and therefore individual who you can visualize and imagine has made that decision. And so the best way to rebut and outframe them is just to talk about your individual again, reiterate that your individual is going to make that other decision because they won't have that level of detail. Does that make sense? It's quite technical, I know.
No, that makes sense. I was typing so I can unmute fast enough. And then the second question, this is more so, I have faced some, what do you call it, feedback from judges where they're like, oh, we got lost in your structure. There's a lack of clarity. And that's generally because when I'm debating it's more like just yapping around. But if I do want to do the storytelling in an effective manner, do you have any suggestions for how to like either structure my pages or my laptop, just the structure of my speech to be able to do it more effectively?
Are you a first or second speaker?
First.
First. Okay. Actually, do you know what? I think it works for both of them. I think it starts from prep. So in prep, the way that I think about things on my sheet is I literally divide my page in three. The first part of my page is just dissecting some of the words in the motion. If I see a verb in the motion or a process like prioritization or we should do something, what's the something, right? And I try and figure out, close my eyes, what does that process look like? And then I think about some of the actors in the motion, and I'm like, okay, what are their incentives? And I might do that for like 30 seconds. The second third of my page has, again, the motion, but I'm thinking, what are going to be the differences between the two teams in terms of what both worlds look like? And as I said to you guys before, don't be biased about this. Just be objective. Like, if the motion was this house with banned drugs, what does the world look like on their side, our side? Our side has weed shops, your side doesn't. Do you know what I mean? It's that difference. And then the final part is, what type of motion is this? What kind of outcomes are in play? What kind of things do we want here? If it's a motion about this house would invade somebody, we're probably going to be talking about like humanitarian stuff and state building and geopolitical aims. If it's a motion about this house believes developing countries should blank, the outcome is probably development, right? And it's obvious, like, kind of which outcomes, which desirable things could flow from this motion or undesirable things. And then the question becomes, for your structure, just mixing and matching those things together to build out a kind of tagline of what you want to be doing. So if you know that you want a certain outcome and you want to prove that these unique things that are going to be unique to your side of the house are going to lead to the outcome that you want, then all I'm going to do is I'm going to put those together. That is now the structure for the first premise of my case. This unique aspect of that only falls on my side of the house leads to this outcome, which is either good or bad. That is premise one of my case. I'm going to prove that by proving, one, that this is actually something that is unique on my side and the extent to which it is. And then two, that it then does lead to the outcome that I desire. And I'm just going to keep mixing and matching the second unique thing, the second outcome. And that is basically what a case is. It's just a mix and match of the candy of those two things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that made a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
Okay, no worries. I believe we are well over time. I'm really sorry, guys, but it was really lovely chatting to you all. If you have any, I'm going to share slides with Parth. You can share it with everyone. If you have any further questions, please feel free to hit me up. I'm in the debater Facebook world. More than happy to answer any questions. And if you're going to Euros, best of luck to everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.